Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, I asked the Minister a question about whether or not this government would respect its duty to consult, and it was in the context of the UN Aboriginal Envoy, Mr. Anaya's comments around a number of issues, but in particular, I wanted to highlight the issues around the First Nations Education Act. And in his statement, he indicated that he had heard that there's a profound and consistent mistrust towards the First Nations Education Act being developed by the federal government. A particular deep concern that the process for developing the Act has not appropriately included nor responded to Aboriginal views. In light of this, I urge the government not to rush forward with this legislation, but to reinitiate discussions with Aboriginal leaders to develop a process and ultimately a bill that addresses Aboriginal concerns and incorporates Aboriginal viewpoints. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've heard from many people since the government released its draft of the First Nations Education Act, and one person who wrote me talked about 7 tests for the First Nations Education Act, and I won't have time to go through all of them, but there are a couple of points I think are important. The first test, does it guarantee actual funding allocations or leave it to the discretion of the department? The second test, does it guarantee needs-based funding or equity to provincial schools? The third test, is this real First Nations control of education, or will the federal government maintain oversight? The fourth test, will this enable the full expression of First Nations languages and cultures in First Nations schools? And there are a number of other important tests, Mr. Speaker. But the reason I raise that is because the government itself commissioned a report called Nurturing the Learning Spirit of First Nations Students. And in that report, there was not agreement on every point in that report, but I think there are a couple of pieces I want to highlight in the context of duty to consult. The report outlined an important principle, and it said that First Nations education reform must be undertaken in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration among First Nations, the Government of Canada, and provincial and territorial governments. And there were a number of recommendations made, but I want to touch on 2 of them. It said a strong First Nations education system will be built upon a solid foundation that encompasses the following. The co-creation of legislation in the form of a First Nation Education Act that outlines responsibilities for each partner in the system and recognizes and protects the First Nations child's right to their culture, language, and identity, a quality education system, funding of the system, and First Nations control of First Nations education. And the other important recommendation, of course, was statutory funding that is needs-based, predictable, sustainable, and used specifically for education purposes. So, Mr. Speaker, in the context of a report that was commissioned by the government, an interim statement by the Special Envoy, Mr. Anaya, on the need for meaningful consultation, and you can read into that accommodation, I want to reiterate my question to the Parliamentary Secretary. Will the government heed the word of the UN Special Rapporteur and respect its duty to consult? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak to the question of the Honourable Member from Nanaimo-Cowichan, a fellow British Columbian and someone that I know is concerned about Aboriginal peoples in Canada. This is my first opportunity to participate in adjournment proceedings, and I'm glad you're in the chair for that experience too, Mr. Speaker. Our government was pleased to have had the opportunity to meet the United Nations Special Rapporteur during his recent visit to Canada. In fact, during his visit, he met with the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, and afterward he stated, quote, "It is clear to me that Canada is aware of and concerned about these issues, and that it is taking steps to address them. I've learned about numerous programs, policies, and efforts that have been rolled out at the federal and provincial levels, and many of these have achieved notable successes." Mr. Speaker, in response to that statement, the Minister said that the social well-being of Aboriginals is at the centre of Canada's preoccupations, and explains why the government has taken and continues to take effective incremental steps to improve the situation. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes the challenges faced by many Aboriginal people in Canada, and that is why we are committed to working collaboratively and creatively on shared priorities and towards moving forward in a spirit of reconciliation on our shared goal with First Nations to create the conditions for healthier, more self-sufficient First Nations communities, and certainly our First Nations Education Act consultations fall into that category. We're happy that the UN Special Rapporteur pointed to the numerous efforts our government has taken to address treaty and Aboriginal claims, as well as to encourage jobs, economic growth, and long-term prosperity for Canada's First Nations communities. The Special Rapporteur's observations in regard to the well-being of Aboriginal peoples clearly illustrate where our government has taken and continues to take practical and incremental steps to improve the situation in collaboration, consultation with Aboriginal peoples. We acknowledge the Special Rapporteur's preliminary observations and recommendations, and we look forward to his final report. Once we receive the final report of the Special Rapporteur, our government will review the report and its conclusions and recommendations. In addition, our government will continue to respect Aboriginal and treaty rights by consulting with those Aboriginal groups whose rights and related interests may be adversely impacted by any proposed activity. Mr. Speaker, it was our government that endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and reaffirmed its commitment to promoting and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. Our endorsement of the Declaration clearly demonstrates our commitment to renew our relationship with Aboriginals and to continue to work in partnership to create a better Canada. Our government has taken considerable steps to address the challenges faced by Aboriginals. Since 2006, we've brought in key legislation to improve First Nations quality of life, governance, and legal protections, and we are committed to taking continued action on this front. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Nanaimo-Cowichan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to welcome the Parliamentary Secretary to his new role, and I look forward to working with him on committee. I need to also put on record a couple of pieces here. Mr. Anaya said that, from all I have learned, I can only conclude that Canada faces a crisis when it comes to the situation of Indigenous peoples of the country. Mr. Anaya went on to say that the Canadian government still has a long way to go in narrowing the well-being gap between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals. And finally, I urge the government not to rush forward with the education reform legislation, but to reinitiate discussions with Aboriginal leaders. And Mr. Speaker, by any test, reinitiating discussions with Aboriginal leaders does not solely rely on a website that says, email us your comments. That is not meaningful consultation. And I want to come back to the report, again, the government's own report that it commissioned that talked about co-creating legislation. Co-creating legislation means that First Nations sit at the table, help develop the process, and are there throughout the entire process, right through to the conclusion of developing the legislation. So I want to ask my question again, Mr. Speaker. Will this government respect its duty to consult and to accommodate First Nations?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, our government takes its legal duty to consult and accommodate very seriously. And we know that where appropriate, we have said that we would accommodate Aboriginal groups if it has been determined that treaty and Aboriginal rights could be impacted. Mr. Speaker, I do take issue with the idea that somehow we're rushing forward on First Nations education reform. We have consulted widely with First Nations right across the country. The minister has put out a proposal for First Nations education. He has not committed to introducing it even in this House before he hears from First Nations right across the country. He sent that document, that idea, that framework to every First Nation in the country, to the national chiefs, to the regional chiefs, the grand chiefs. First Nations people right across the country will have an opportunity, as will all other interested stakeholders, to provide their input, to be consulted, and to give us their ideas on what they think should be in a First Nations Education Act, because, Mr. Speaker, we know that we need to improve First Nations education in Canada, and that is something that our government is certainly committed to.